Hello everyone. In this session, we'll deploy a stateless application using the Google Kubernetes Engine. To do so, we will follow the tutorial found on the Google website using the link below here. This video session is for the beginners in Kubernetes. So if you're advanced, if you already know about Kubernetes, you can skip this session. This session is part of a video series covering Kubernetes. Okay, so what is a stateless application? We all know what a stateless application is. There is no data's persistence in a stateless application. For example, front-end application is stateless, and in order to increase its availability, we can deploy multiple replicas, and also if the demand is low, then we can reduce the number of replicas set as well. So what are we going to do in this session? So we have the Docker Hub where all the Docker images reside. And on the Google Cloud Platform side, we assume that you already have a Kubernetes cluster and you have at least one or two nodes running in that cluster. And what we're going to do is we're going to take an nginx image that is residing in the Docker Hub, and we are going to pull that image from the Docker Hub and run 3 replicas of that nginx image in the Kubernetes cluster. So the tutorial, I believe, uses a different application, different image, but it should be fairly straightforward to follow as well. So what we are going to do is we're going to pull the nginx image from the Docker Hub. Okay, so to deploy this nginx image in the Kubernetes cluster, we can do it many ways. But what we're going to do is we're going to use a manifest file, a YAML manifest file that defines the deployment, and we're going to use this approach to deploy the nginx image. So before we delve into the deployment part of it, let's have a quick look at what YAML is. So YAML stands for yet another markup language, and YAML is a superset of JSON, which means that if you have a valid JSON file, it is also a valid YAML file. So YAML to me is it's very user friendly in the sense you can easily read a YAML file. In order to understand YAML file, there's only two types of structures that you need to understand: maps and lists. So if you understand these two types of structures, then you can easily read a YAML file. Now, a lot of you might also be familiar with JSON files. So if you worked with JavaScript, JSON file, you should be able to interpret a JSON file. So I'll show you examples of JSON file snippets, and then I'll show you the corresponding YAML file as well. So here is a JSON file, and there are two simple properties, first name and last name, and the values are Milton and Chandradas. Now the corresponding YAML file is a little bit more it's user friendly, like you can read this a little bit better than the JSON file. So here again you have the key value pair, first name Milton, last name Chandradas. So this is how this JSON file would get translated into a YAML file. Now let's take a little bit complex JSON example. So in this case, we have two simple properties, first name and last name. But in addition to these simple properties, you also have a complex property called address, which in turn has 4 different simple properties: street, city, state, and zip. So let's see how this translates into a YAML file. And again, you see that the YAML file, it's much more easier to read. So you have the first name, the key value pair, first name, last name. Now you have the address, which is a complex property, but you see that the street, city, state, and zip, which are the simple properties, indented, and therefore it is a part of this address property. Now, a quick note on this indentation. So the indentation, it needs to have at least one or more spaces, and you have to be very consistent with the spacing. So for example, if a street, I believe it is indented by one space, so the city, state, and zip, they all need to be indented by one space, exactly by one space. So you don't want to, so if you're using one space as the indentation, you want to be very consistent with that. And also to note, do not use tabs when you're using YAML file. So you see how it is, you can take a JSON file and convert it into YAML file fairly easily. Now, I did mention that there are two structures that you need to be aware of. This is the map structure. The other thing is the list structure. So in JSON, you have the concept of an array. So some of my interests are soccer, tennis, and chess. Um, and so if I wanted to convert this into a YAML file, so the YAML file would look something similar to this. Again, very easy to read. You have the first name, last name, and then you have the list, and then you have all the soccer, tennis, and chess as my list. So you see how easy it is to convert a JSON file to YAML, and for the most part, when you're um, when you're using Kubernetes, you'll be dealing a lot with YAML files. So it's good to know uh, the how YAML file is structured. And like I said, as long as you know maps and lists, then you're good to go with YAML file. Okay, so this is an example of a deployment manifest file. So if I deploy this manifest file, then I can achieve what I wanted to do. So I can take the nginx image from the Docker Hub, and I can make 3 replicas of it and run it on my Kubernetes engine. So let's go ahead and kind of break down this manifest file and see how it is structured. So first off, let's start with the first two simple properties. Very simple as you can see. The API version, we say apps/v1. So if you're using an older version of the Kubernetes, then you would use app/v1 beta 2. But for all practical purposes, you'll be using app/v1 from now on. The kind, um, right now this is a deployment file because we want to deploy the nginx image. But there are other kinds as well. For example, you can have a service manifest file as well. So that explains the first two lines. And let's go to the second part of it, the metadata, and then you give the name of this deployment. So obviously, as it suggests, so this is the name of the deployment, and this is how Kubernetes understands what the deployment name is. So once you create the deployment, you can get more information about this deployment by running this kubectl command, describe deployment, and then you would provide this deployment name. So in this case, you would say kubectl describe deployment nginx/deployment. And when you're done with all this Kubernetes stuff, and when you want to delete the deployment, then you would just say kubectl delete deployment and then the name of this deployment. Um,
Now let's talk about the labels and label selectors together. Labels are key value pairs that can be attached to any Kubernetes objects. In this deployment file, we have a label that is attached to a pod. You can have additional labels as well. So in this example, we have a label with the key as app. and the value as nginx. So you can have additional labels. For example, you can have key as release and value as stable as well. So why do we use labels? Basically, it's a way of having some kind of organization structure into objects, but in a loosely coupled fashion. Labels are used to organize and select a subset of Kubernetes objects. Now you have the concept of label selectors as well. So with label selectors, you can identify a set of objects. For example, you can issue a kubectl command that gets pods with the label app equals nginx. Now, Kubernetes API supports two types of selectors. One is equality based and the other is set based. When it comes to equality based, it supports simple operators like equal to or not equal to. So, for example, you can get all the pods where the key equals app and nginx is the value. So, this is equality based. But with set based, you can have more complex operators like like in, not in, exists, and so on. So now the other thing to also note is the selector match labels. This should exactly match the labels that's specified in spec template metadata labels.
Okay, so now let's go to the replicas 3. So it is fairly straightforward. We just say, hey, I want 3 copies of the nginx image running. So you can scale up or down based on the number of replicas here. Now this replicas is also the desired state. So the controller is going to match the actual state with the desired state. Now, this is the key part of the deployment manifest file, and this is where you tell the manifest file, the deployment, what you want to run, where you want to run, and so on. So this is the pod template. So this template describes your pod. So if you think about it, in a pod, you want to know which image to run, which the name of the container, the port you want to expose, and so on. So this is your pod template. We already looked at the metadata labels. We know that the metadata labels should match the spec selector. So we'll go back. We'll talk about the containers. So here we are running a container in this pod, one container, a single container, and we specify the name of the container to be nginx, and we say that the image needs to be nginx 1.7.9, and since we don't have a prefix to it, that means it's going to get it from the Docker Hub. And the port, we are going to do port 80. So the port 80 should be exposed from the container. So in other words, it will look something like this. You have the pod, you have a single container, and the name of that container is going to be nginx. The image is the nginx 1.7.9 version, and the port that needs to be exposed on this container is port 80. And so we have the deployment file. In order to create the deployment file, it's as easy as running this command, kubectl apply-f deployment file. That's the name of the deployment file, the YAML file. And once you create the deployment, you can go ahead and get more information about this deployment by running this kubectl command. And later on, when you want to delete the deployment, you can go ahead and run this kubectl delete deployment command as well. So that's it for this session. In the next session, I'll do like a step-by-step on how we create this deployment, get more information, and so on. So if you do like this video, please subscribe to this channel, and I'll talk to you next week.